MP John Waluke, and he is co-accused in the NCPB fraud case is justified. Get on Twitter, tell us what you think. I will be sampling your views as we go along. I am at Trix Ingado. Michael is at Michael G. Gitonga, and the hashtag to use is KTN Morning Express. But far from that, today is the 26th of June, and that is the day when we mark the International Day in support of torture victims. This is a day where we support them, raise awareness for that, and to get that, we're going to have Executive Director for IMLU, Peter Kiama, who's going to join us just to shed a light on what this day is about, what you need to know, the situation in the country, and much, much more that surrounds torture. Welcome to the show, Mr. Kiama.
Thank you very much.
Now, let's start off with the day itself. Why, in fact, do we commemorate this day, aside from what I've already said?
Thank you for having us today. The UN International Day in support of victims of torture is a day that was established so that we are able to show solidarity to those who have suffered torture and other forms of inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment. It is a day to raise the voice of victims, survivors, as well as their families, because we do know that some of the people who suffer torture lose their lives.
Yes.
Some of them survive. That's why we call them survivors. And those who pass away leave families behind. And so we also show solidarity to the families of victims of torture who have lost their lives.
Right. And now when you talk about torture, in what context is it? And we do understand that it is a crime, in fact, an international crime to do this, but in what context does it happen? Is this just on law enforcement? Does it encompass civilian activities? How do you encompass the context of torture?
Yeah, torture is a violation of human rights under the UN Convention Against Torture.
Yes.
Torture is also a crime within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the international level, but it also has been domesticated in the Prevention of Torture Act 2017, where torture is defined as a crime against humanity, and it invites 25 years in jail for perpetrators.
Locally?
Locally, yes, in Kenya. And 15 years for other forms of degrading, inhuman treatment or punishment. You do know that people suffer indignity in the hands of law enforcement agencies that might not amount to torture, but it's still a violation of human rights. And so they need to recognize that as well. Absolutely,
and that brings me to still on the contextualization of torture. A lot of people think of it in terms of terrorism and, warfare and prisoners of war, but it does take place. I'd like us to emphasize on that in our local societies, right?
Yes, it does. Torture exists in this country, has been existing for a long time. Remember, torture was one of the key issues, key subject issues that was handled by the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission a few years ago. And that issue is still pending. The survivors of torture from, the time we got independence, most of them have never received justice, neither have received any compensation for suffering torture in the hands of, public officials, especially law enforcement agencies.
Or people acting for the powers that be, right?
Exactly. So when you talk about torture, torture is defined within the confines of a public official violating the rights of citizens. So torture does not apply in our context under the Prevention of Torture Act 2017. It does not apply to a wife battering a husband or a husband battering a spouse. It is public officials in the process of enforcing the law and maybe, applying brutal force or psychological, force to extract information, to punish somebody for an act that has been committed, or to punish somebody for an act committed by somebody else. So it applies to public officials only in our context.
There has to be a power dynamic. That's what you're saying.
Yes, there has to be officialdom within it. Yes, yes.
Right. Now, let's talk about the people who have never gotten justice as far as torture is concerned. There is an act that is meant to tend to these people. It has not been implemented. Tell us about that.
Yes, I would like first of all to recognize that Kenya has ratified the UN Convention Against Torture, which is a plus for this country.
Yes.
Then we've gone further in 2017 by domesticating, meaning enacting a specific law in this country that prohibits torture and provides for punishment for acts of torture, but also provides for compensation for those who suffer torture in the hands of government officials. Now, the challenge we have currently is that the law is in place, but the law is not being used to investigate and prosecute those who perpetrate torture. So far, since 2017, we have no single case of a law enforcement officer investigated and charged for the offense of torture, or even for the offense of other forms of degrading, inhuman treatment or punishment. So that is one gap that we have, and that we are raising the voice to government agencies within the criminal justice system to apply the law as it is, because the law is not enacted in vain. The law is supposed to be is enacted to improve our lives as citizens. The other aspect of the law that has not been implemented is setting up the fund to compensate victims of torture and inhuman treatment. And therefore you find that we have a victim trust fund under the Victim Protection Act of 2014. Now the challenge is that the board was set up a number of years ago, but there are no regulations to guide how victims can access the fund. Yet the government, year in, year out, sort of provides the money, but the money cannot be accessed by those who have been awarded compensation by our judicial system.
Yes, and those who have been seen to have a right to claim, or rather to justice as far as them having been on the receiving end of torture. Let's walk back to the element of there not having been any prosecutions since 2017. This is not because of a lack of those crimes being committed against these people, right? So as IMLU, could you shed more light on what's been happening on the ground, and why exactly is it that people aren't getting the justice that they do deserve?
What you do find that torture continues to happen, especially within the law enforcement process, mainly by the National Police Service. Last year we documented 15 cases of torture, and when I talk about 15, one might wonder, why are we concerned about 15? We need to underline the fact that torture is the worst crime you can commit against another human being. Perhaps explain why on a psychological and physical level. Because torture takes away your dignity. It subjects you to physical and emotional pain that many people never recover from. Right. If you look at the people who suffered torture during the Nyayo era, during the time of the Kanu regime in the 80s and 90s, a good number of those people are walking zombies. They've never been able to recover. They try their best. They try to get psychological counseling. Some of them have never been able to recover their livelihoods. They lost it completely. We encountered one case which was quite dramatic, which maybe I want to illustrate with. Yes, please. Of, I think he's about 69 years old now, a former Kenya Air Force officer. During the coup, was arrested, was detained, lost everything. Now, when we finally met with him, he had completely lost himself, his dignity. He had become an introvert, somebody who was very highly educated, both locally and internationally as a Kenya Air Force pilot. Now, we don't know what happened. It's more than 30 years ago. Right. What we know is that this particular individual was subjected to treatment that completely took away his humanity and personality, his dignity. Yes. Now, when he went through counseling by our team of counselors, he finally appeared on one of the TV stations, And a family member called me and said, you know what? Now I know what you at IMLU do. Because my uncle has never spoken about this for the last 30 years. I'm finding him on TV. I can't believe it is him.
Right.
Okay? So for 30 years, this person has been affected. And therefore, last year we documented 15 cases.
Yes.
This year, between January and June, especially between March and June, last week, we've documented 41 cases, which means that the incidences of torture has risen in the period of enforcing the measures to combat COVID-19, which is a serious indictment in terms of our criminal justice system enforcing laws or regulations that are supposed to safeguard our lives.
Yes, and torture is actually high-handedness, particularly when you're talking about law enforcement. Could we just digress a bit and talk about why this particular point in history where we are trying to have curfews enforced, why is it that now we're seeing an uptick in people being killed by the police? At the same time, we are finding, as you have said, the cases of torture increasing. What is very special about this moment that seems to be making law enforcers rather trigger happy?
Well, in our own investigations during this COVID-19 period, we have seen a replica of what happens every time there's an escalation of a situation. Okay, we see that every 5 years during the general election, where police kill more people than they ever kill during other periods that are not a general election period. So what has happened is that we do believe that our National Police Service is not well equipped to handle situations of escalation, in that their default mode is using force to compel people to obey regulations or guidelines that have been issued by government.
Yes.
So, and that doesn't help. Our constitution requires the police to engage with the public and nurture productive partnerships with communities and groups. But what we find is that when police are deployed, in most cases, and we saw that in Nandi yesterday, just because of a face mask, we see a huge escalation. So our police officers, most of them, now that we have been able to investigate this for a long time, are not equipped for problem solving, to de-escalate situations. They actually go into a situation and escalate it. And that leads into death, leads into injuries. And that's the same thing we've seen during COVID-19. We saw that at the Kenya ferry in services in Mombasa. The first 72 hours of the curfew, we saw the escalation. People could not fit into the ferry at the same time, but we saw the police beating them down, and risking their lives, risking infection spreading around that particular situation. So I think it's the modus operandi of the police, of the National Police Service, that needs to change.
It does need to change, but does this go down to training, or what sort of reforms can be made? Because you have said this is quite specific to law enforcers. What needs to change? How can this be approached in order to ensure that we put an end to incidences of torture?
Several things need to change. And as I say that several things need to change, we are not seeing these situations because we don't have requisite laws. We have enough laws to guide the National Police Service, the Kenya Prison Service, and other law enforcement agencies, because we also see torture being committed by Kenya Forest Service guards, Kenya Wildlife Service guards. So we have the requisite laws, we have the requisite regulations. What needs to change is the institutional culture, the attitudes, the software, and the command of the National Police Service needs to change. We need to see more inspections of police stations by the commanders at a higher level, including the sub-county commanders, including those in charge of the police stations. We need to start insisting on command responsibility. Even as we pursue individual criminal responsibility, like we saw in Nandi yesterday, where the officer was interdicted, we need to ask ourselves, when these officers were killing these people yesterday, where was the commander? What instructions did he or she issue to these people? Yeah? So we need to see the commanders being able to encourage a change of attitude and a change of behavior among the officers under their command, because that's where it starts.
Yes.
What instructions, what culture is the commander encouraging? Yeah.
And often an area that I'm glad that you mentioned, that the Kenya Wildlife Service, that goes largely unreported or underreported. Could you shed a light on what happens, or what some of the cases that you've gotten out of that area, and how IMLU has stepped in the gap to ensure that some of these cases lead to some sort of justice?
What has happened is that the conduct of the National Police Service has ended up in a copycat.
Okay.
So the way they do it, because they get away with it, most of them get away with it, then the Kenya Forest Service also copies the same. The Kenya Wildlife Service copies the same. The Kanjo Askaris in Nairobi have copied the same. We have documented cases of torture by the Kanjo Askaris of hawkers, poor people who are just struggling to make a living off the streets. Kanjo Askaris carrying along, daggers in their jackets, and then stabbing, hawkers to get them away from the streets. So this default mode of saying citizens cannot understand the instructions unless we use force, must end in our country. We are not under colonialism. Neither are we under occupation. We are governed by a government that is guided by a constitution that has a very robust Bill of Rights. Our law enforcement agencies must understand that and adhere to the Constitution. So the Kenya Wildlife Service, we've been following these cases in Isiolo, in Tana River, in Kajiado, in Makueni as well. We have seen cases of Kenya Wildlife Service rangers arresting suspected poachers. And what they do is torture them. What they do is shoot them dead, execute them literally. And that doesn't help. The difficulty is that most of these institutions, when we raise those issues, deny. Instead of accepting that there's a problem within their rank and file and deal with it and ask for partnerships with us and others to deal with those issues, they mainly deny and defend. So that defensive posture does not help us to move forward as a country.
Yes. Now, Mr. Kiama, I realize that we are referring to this in a very abstract way, torture. And, well, aside from killings, could you explain exactly, perhaps there's someone who's watching at home and they're hearing about torture, but because of the normalization of it, all the violence from law enforcers, they might think this is just how things should be. So what exactly, literally, would count as torture? What would be done to an individual for them to know, no, this is a line that has been crossed, it is no longer law enforcement as it should be, but it is actually something that falls under the umbrella of torture?
There are many forms of torture, some historical, some still current. Some of the measures, some of the ways of, meting torture against, citizens is beatings. Beatings to a point where the pain is so traumatic that you admit to things that you would not admit in ordinary circumstances. Pain inflicted through physical means. And we have seen that during the enforcement of the curfew and other measures around COVID-19. We've seen police use batons. We've seen police kick people down. We've seen police step on people's chests and heads and necks. We've seen police use threats. Threats inflict mental torture. We have seen people being arrested and being held in custody unnecessarily, just to threaten them and punish them. Because punishment is also a crime within the Prevention of Torture Act. So those are some of the measures. Some of the other measures would involve forcing people to imbibe maybe drinks or food particles. So those are some of the measures that we see that happen. Others are sexual.
Please explain that bit, because it might seem a bit. How asking someone to eat something, how does that count as food? as you know, torture?
Forceful feeding.
Okay.
Amounts to torture.
Okay.
And we have seen that in the past.
Right. And
sexual violence is
yes.
also another one. We've seen, the media has covered during this period of COVID-19. The media have covered police officers, grabbing the private parts of, the genitalia of men in the process of arresting. And you wonder whether that's the acceptable way of enforcing an arrest.
Right.
There's a particular training on how to enforce an arrest, and one of them is not
does not include
injuring the genitalia
yes.
of human beings.
Yeah. And you've talked about sexual assault, and you remember last year during the Sudan uprising, there was a lot of women were subjected to this for being part of the protest. At what extent does that happen in this country?
What happens in some of the instances, and we've covered that especially during the general elections, 2017, as well as 2007. We have a case in court against the Kenya government for rape and defilement during the 2007 general elections, where uniformed police officers actually committed, crimes of rape, against women. Now you ask yourself, where does that fall within the realm of law enforcement? And I will tell you, there's that is totally unacceptable within the realms of law enforcement. The police are deployed even in escalated situations like, electoral violence, to de-escalate the situation, to protect the population, not to harm them. We do understand that our law provides that police can use lethal force, can use necessary force, as and when their lives are in danger. But the act of knocking people's doors, going in, fighting women in those, slum areas, and raping them in the course of law enforcement is totally unacceptable. It is a crime that this country has to deal with, in a very determined manner. Because when you allow it to happen once, it continues to happen.
Right. Yeah. And far from the lack of implementation, when you're going to court and trying to help these people get justice, what are some of the challenges that you encounter? In corruption, we're told about evidence missing. Even when it comes to child defilement, we're told sometimes the people do not even know how to gather evidence or preserve it. What in these instances stand between justice and these people and justice?
There are several obstacles towards justice for victims. One of them is the level of fear and intimidation. Because we did a survey in 2017. We do that almost every 5 years. 2016 survey, a national perception survey on torture. And we found out that 33% of the people interviewed had suffered torture in the last 5 years. In a previous survey like that, we had found that about 23% had suffered torture. So the numbers had gone up 5 years later. Yeah. Now, most of those who have suffered torture and ill treatment are people who live in low socioeconomic situations. Okay. Meaning that they are already vulnerable. Either they don't have the money, they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the connections to be able to defend themselves. And so they are already vulnerable, and because of their vulnerability, because they are poor, then they suffer these violations. Right. So some of the challenges then are intimidation and fear, because the perpetrators can access where these people live. Yes. They can access them in the streets, they know them. Number two is the criminal justice system with regard to protection of witnesses. We know we have in Kenya a witness protection agency. But it's not enough. It doesn't have the capacity to protect everybody. And it has a limitation because in most cases, the witness protection agency can only take you under their cover once the case has gone to court. And you now need to be protected so that you can be able to go and testify. Okay. But remember, for people in already vulnerable situations to come forward to make a statement with us, for example, or provide evidence, we need to assure them of protection. Safety, in most cases, we don't have the capacity. Okay. Now,
Yeah, we're running out of time, Mr. Kiama, so I'd like just you to touch briefly on post-torture care. Do you help these people move on with their lives? And then your closing comments on this whole situation.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we do support, we do provide, apart from the legal work that we do, providing legal support for people to seek justice in courts, we also provide psychosocial support, what we call psychological rehabilitation, for both survivors of torture, but also their families, because torture affects not only the individual, but families as well as communities for a long time. We also provide medical rehabilitation. We treat wounds where necessary.
Right.
But we also provide forensic support. If a victim of torture passes away, we are able to provide a pathologist to collect forensic evidence to confirm the cause of death. So the family can be able to have a closure on how this person died, but also use the evidence to go to court.
Okay.
My final word is that as we celebrate this UN Day in support of victims of torture,
yes,
I would call upon Kenyans to condemn all acts of torture,
right,
and to raise the voice for victims, but also for the government to gazette the regulations that will help victims access compensation. We have victims awarded over 19 million shillings,
yes,
but they can't access the money because the regulations have not been gazetted.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That is Peter Kiama, the Executive Director at IMLU. Thank you for your insights on this issue of torture. Hopefully things will change for the better. We are asking you to be a part of the conversation on Twitter. We are asking you, do you think the penalty imposed